It's 2025, which means we're halfway through the decade, and so I thought it would be a good time to reflect on what cinema has brought us so far. To me, when I think about what movies of the 2020s will be considered future classics, which will be considered the best, I mostly think about the idea of which movies live on, which movies will endure, which movies will stand the test of time in some way or another. And there are different ways to do that. A movie doesn't just have to be the most prestigious to survive, it can also survive in different ways. It can become like a cult classic or just a beloved blockbuster favorite. And what I want to do here in what I suspect will be a series of videos is to honor those different ways in which movies live on and to reflect those different categories in which they can endure. I also wanted to do this because in my big video about the 50 most life-changing movies ever made, the most recent one was actually from 2019, and so it was just a fun exercise to imagine what movies from 2020 and onwards will someday potentially be included in that list or in a list like it if I ever choose to expand it. So yeah, that's what we're gonna do. We're gonna imagine what movies will live on in different ways. We're gonna look at some cult classics, we're gonna look at some hidden gems, some blockbuster favorites. But first today I do want to start with the more traditional list of movies that are just the most prestigious. And for the first movie on that list, I might have some recency bias because I literally just saw it last night for the first time. But it's Paul Thomas Anderson's One Battle After Another. I've been thinking about this movie all day because it's just such a difficult one to reduce into a simple summary or statement, and I think that only testifies to its quality and its depth and the many layers that I think are present here and which will be continued to talk about for some time to come, I can imagine. Besides just being wildly entertaining and very funny and very suspenseful and beautifully shot and well acted and with a great score, what struck me the most about this movie is the way it plays with the tension between dedicating your life to a cause and also wanting a life of one's own. And especially in a generational context, there's a beautiful complexity that the movie adds to that discussion where it really becomes like a poignant rumination about the idea of bringing children into a world that we weren't able to save and how we deal with that tension between hope and despair and between continuing or wanting to continue the fight and to desiring some kind of resolution, some kind of peace, also not just for yourself, but again, mainly for your children, so that they won't face the same struggles that you did. And so yeah, it's a very timely movie in the sense that it's very much set in the present day and the present political and cultural struggles. But I think within it, it also has that timeless message that I think will make the movie endure long after all those political, cultural struggles have changed. So yeah, that's why I wanted to include this one. I feel like it's a pretty safe bet for what will be considered a future classic. So yeah, that would be my first pick.
God damn it! Viva la revolution!
Sticking with Leonardo DiCaprio, the second movie on my list would be Killers of the Flower Moon by Martin Scorsese.
Oh, Sage, they have the worst land possible, but the good Lord, he outsmarted everybody.
I think with Killers of the Flower Moon, Martin Scorsese has just created such a beautiful and tragic epic that not only reflects on American history and the historical injustices that have shaped modern America, but he also beautifully reflects on the medium of cinema itself and the idea or the art of storytelling and the way that can be employed for both good and ill, for enlightenment and just morbid curiosities and entertainment value or even shock value.
Byron got her drunk, and I did the rest.
But yeah, this is a big movie, it's a very long movie, but it's nevertheless one that has a great flow to it. I don't think it's necessarily fast-paced, but it's still one that's nevertheless engaging throughout its 3 to 4, I don't remember exactly, it's very long runtime. And most importantly, I think it's a movie that just really well explores the sort of banality of evil and the ease by which we can just completely hollow out our own soul and not even notice it until it's already long gone and it's way too late to reclaim what little justice there is left or what little salvation there is left. I think it's just one of those aspects of our humanity that we still find very hard to grapple with. And I think this movie does it very well and does it in a way that I think will remain relevant in the years to come.
Made you do bad things and take advantage of you because of your disposition.
On a similar note, the next movie that I want to talk about here is The Zone of Interest by Jonathan Glazer. With this movie, I think one of the strongest signs that this was going to be one for the ages was just seeing how quickly the very title, which also just relates to the main conceit of the film, the main concept, how quickly that became a concept of its own and just a concept to be employed in real world situations. It's one of those things where you name something and it immediately becomes potent in a way that helps to illuminate and enlighten certain situations and modes of being in human beings, basically. Because even though it's a historical movie, it's set in the past and it could have well very much been perceived as saying something about that historical period only. I thought it was just remarkable to see how quickly the idea of a zone of interest was already applied to many other situations and instances that are currently ongoing, tragically so. And in that sense, this is definitely one of the more important movies of the decade for me, just for that contribution alone. On its own right, it's also just a very haunting movie still. I don't think I've ever seen anything quite like it. It's just a way that Glazer captures that kind of underlying nightmarish horror that underpins every profane or banal moment of the everyday. You know, it's something that goes beyond the banality of evil as it is often conceptualized. I think it really captures something deeper about the way evil just eats us out from the inside. You know, similar as I talked about with Killers of the Flower Moon, the previous movie. There's just a way that evil sort of settles into the basement of our being, like a mold that then starts eating it from the inside out. That I think this movie captures, unlike anything I've ever seen, as just a purely visceral experience.
All right, let's stop here.
Next up is Tar, which was just one of those movies where afterwards you have to Google if it wasn't based on an actual person, because it just felt like such a well-realized, lived-in character.
As if that's not enough, her new book, Tar on Tar, will be published by Nantalise.
And that's one of the main things I love about this movie so much. The way Lydia Tar, its titular character, just feels like an actual person, like an actual three-dimensional, complicated human being who is just filled with internal contradictions and conflicting desires, and which then clash with the real world, which in turn causes even more internal turmoil. And yeah, that's just something that this movie does really well.
Don't be so eager to be offended. The narcissism of small differences leads to the most boring conformity.
I also think this movie touches very interestingly on subjects like art, or rather problematic art, you know, art that was born out of people who weren't necessarily the most ideal or the most morally consistent, which includes eventually Lydia Tar herself. And it's also just about that tension between the subconscious and the conscious, you know, the image of ourselves that we want to pursue and that which is sort of in the basement that is also coming up and messing with that ideal. In this way, it also becomes a movie that's about guilt and the reluctance of having to face consequences for our actions. And yeah, the movie just portrays all this very thoughtfully, very well structured, and just in a way that few movies manage to achieve. Speaking of movies that feel like real-life biographies, next up is The Brutalist.
1, 2, 3.
I've been contemplating for quite a while whether or not I should include the movie in this category, because while to me it was just immediately such a timeless masterpiece, unlike many of the other movies on this list, I feel like everyone else is not quite there yet, and it's definitely a movie that came out with some controversy, or at least, some elements that people felt unsure about, mainly the ending, but to me, I've seen it twice now, and the second time is really where this movie opened up for me as this deeper movie that's not just about capitalism or art or patronage, the struggle between the artist and his patron.
We tolerate you.
But it's also just such a beautifully tragic movie about love and the desire for real connection and to just have ourselves actualized through our connection to other people. And I feel like it's that aspect that has gone largely overlooked so far, but that just, for me at least, really hit me on that second viewing. I actually made a video about it on the main channel. That was one of the least popular ones that I've ever made. But still, I do feel confident that people will come around eventually. That when this movie has had some time for audiences to fully digest it, I think it will be one that is recognized as the masterpiece that it is and the one that therefore belongs on this list. Or, that's my hope at least.
Follow you until I die.
Next up is a real biographical account, Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer.
I don't wish the culmination of 3 centuries of physics to be a weapon of mass destruction.
I know this will also be a somewhat controversial pick for some people, but I think this is genuinely one of Nolan's better films and one that only gets better with each viewing. I've already said this before a couple of times, but what I feel like is the key to unlocking this movie is that line that says,
"The important thing isn't can you read music, it's can you hear it. Can you hear the music, Robert?"
Because that to me really feels like the best description as to how to engage this movie. Not as a very dialogue-heavy, discussion-heavy movie about real-life politics, but rather as this sort of mythical symphony almost about Prometheus, really. About meddling with forces of nature that we shouldn't have, and about reckoning with our own individual place in the sort of larger chain of causality, where it feels like we have agency in the present, but on a broader scale, or like when we zoom out, it also starts to feel like that agency is sort of erased in a larger chain of events or a larger chain of dominoes that feel like they were determined to fall over anyways. In this sense, I think it's actually a remarkably complex movie about Oppenheimer, and I feel like this is just one of those movies that could have so easily been a lazy condemnation, or that's just a story about a bad man who did a bad thing and you should therefore judge him for it. But instead, I love the way Nolan just manages to bring the viewer into that experience and make them complicit in a way. Not necessarily as a way to shift your judgment about Oppenheimer, but rather to illustrate the sort of deeper forces that drove him and that still drive us to this day. On a somewhat related note, the next movie is Anatomy of a Fall. I know you might be thinking, what does this movie have to do with Oppenheimer? But what to me is the most striking element about this movie, or the one thing that has stuck with me ever since I watched it, I've only seen this one time, is the way it captures that sort of frightening idea of having your life put under a magnifying glass and having everything taken out of context and complicated and problematized. Because that to me is ultimately what this movie is about. It's about a woman who stands trial for the potential murder of her husband, who may or not have suffered an accident. But the real sort of existential terror here is that idea that people suddenly scrutinize your every little detail of your life and just question everything about it.
You made us live here among the goats. You complain about the life that you chose. You're not a victim.
And it just makes you realize so viscerally that even though you think you may have a mostly coherent identity or a mostly consistent life story, so to say, when you really start to scrutinize that, it's just so frightening how easily it can come falling apart and how many contradictions there actually are, and many inconsistencies or things that are just all these little details that seemed inconspicuous to you that suddenly turn suspect in the eyes of someone else.
sometimes a couple is kind of a chaos and everybody is lost, no?
Yeah, there was just something haunting about that has stayed with me ever since I saw this movie, and which is the main reason why I think this will endure. Okay, so originally I was gonna talk about The Worst Person of the World next by Joachim Trier, but after seeing Sentimental Value, his next movie at the Cannes Film Festival, I think I might enjoy that one even more.
I can't work with him. We can't really talk.
I still really love The Worst Person in the World. I think it's a great movie about finding yourself and struggling with existential questions in your 20s and early 30s. But with Sentimental Value, I think he did all that and more, as he really made it part of this bigger family epic that spans like an entire family's story. I know most people haven't seen this one yet, so I won't spoil anything about it at this point. But I did feel like it was just such a beautiful story about the relation between a father and his daughters, between a director and his actresses, and about the way that art becomes a language that allows us to communicate in ways that normal language can't. The last two movies on this list are actually both feature debuts, which is kind of remarkable, I think. The first one is Aftersun by Charlotte Wells.
I love you.
Which is a beautiful story about a woman who dives back in this fragmented past filled with partial memories and imaginations and actual footage of the time that she's venturing into. It all comes together as this mosaic that tries to reconstruct an image of her estranged father or her long-lost father. Paul Mescal is really great here as this struggling father whose interiority you never quite have access to, but which nevertheless manages to convey all these hints that allow us to guess at the internal turmoil that's going on inside him. I thought it was just a really unique approach to this type of story, one that I hadn't quite seen before in the same way. But yeah, I just love the way it plays with the sort of fluidity of memory and of our subjective images of those who are close to us, and the way it captures the pain of never truly being able to bridge those gaps. Lastly then, we have Celine Song's Past Lives, which is about a woman who connects with a former love interest, which causes her to sort of reflect on how she got to the life that she is living, how she got to the partner that she's living with, and just got her wondering about the life that could have been.
I'm really glad you came here. It was the right thing to do.
What I probably loved most about this movie is the way it feels like it never puts the main relationship or the existing relationship in jeopardy. You know, the movie presents a love triangle, but it never felt like the main character was ever going to decide one way or another, or she was never going to change the decisions that she's already made. Instead, it was just more about the weight of those emotions behind it, the way we all come to wonder at some point what could have been, you know, what would have happened if life had pushed us in a different direction, or if we chose differently between another partner, and would we have been just as happy or even more happy or less so. And what I think this movie does really well is that although it recognizes the very real weight of those questions and the very real presence of those questions as they inevitably become a part of our inner psyche, they also are ultimately fundamentally unresolvable. And so in the end, it's more about accepting the choices that we did make and embracing the people who we did end up with. And yeah, I think that's just a very profound idea, and I think this movie just delivers it with such tenderness and beauty and thoughtfulness in a way that really speaks to the sort of poetry that I think exists in the human heart. You know, the kind of poetry that causes us to wonder about such existential questions to begin with. And that's the end of my list. At least for now, that is. Definitely let me know in the comments what you thought about it, what movies you would have included in this list of the most prestigious movies of the 2020s so far. If you're surprised at some of the movies that were missing, I may have included them in the upcoming categories. You know, next up I'm gonna talk about the cult classics, or what I think will be the future cult classics. which are movies that are not necessarily beloved among general audiences, but which do have a very strong, albeit small, fan base. So yeah, that's up next. Stay tuned for that one. Also definitely let me know what movies you would include in that categories. I'd love to hear what you think will be the future cult classics. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.